Hello, everyone. This is Karen Yakos from Local Motion. I'm the executive director here, and we've got Curt McCormack in the room with us today, thankfully and luckily, to be able to talk to you about all things bike walk related for the state when it comes to policy and infrastructure. I am going to hand this off to my colleague Allegra in a minute here. She runs our Livable Streets program here at Local Motion, just to go through some of the setup for you all on the webinar as people join, because we still have people joining. And then I'll take the mic back and we'll get the webinar started. So without further ado, this is Allegra.
Great, welcome everyone. So a couple quick housekeeping notes. Everyone who's joined the webinar today is automatically muted, so you don't have to worry about that. And there's two different ways to raise a question or share an idea. One is if you want to speak directly, just to raise your hand. There's a little icon in the sidebar to do that, and everyone will hear you. And then if you wanted to submit a question anonymously or have us share it, you can just type it into the sidebar under the questions. So, and feel free if you have any just questions about how to do that, you can also send those in, and Mary Catherine and I will work with you on that. So I'm going to turn it back over to Karen and Curt for intros.
Hi, everyone. And I just want to reinforce, and I'll do that a couple times as we go through, that send your questions in as this is happening so that we can start to queue those up. I think that'll be helpful to all of us. So I just want to say that for those of you that don't know Local Motion, we are a statewide advocacy organization here in Vermont. We work coast to coast, so to speak, north and south, east and west. We have been around for 20 years. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, which is very exciting. We started, the genesis of the organization 20 years ago was with the bike path, the bridge that goes over the Winooski River, helping people to move along the bike path all the way to the causeway, and now run a ferry out there that allow you to get across from Colchester to South Hero, and I hope many of you have done that. If not, it's worth doing this summer. It's a very fun ride, world class, I would say. Since that time, we have broadened out into all areas of biking and walking. We do education programs in schools. We do a lot of work with cities on bringing good infrastructure into their communities to helping kids get safely to school. We do workshops around the state to help you as bikers know how to do that safely. We work with towns to mock up things like crosswalks to see how they can work, and then hopefully get those adopted, and a whole host of other things. So check us out on the website if you don't know us. And our overall goal is to get biking and walking to be a way of life in every corner of Vermont. So we're very excited about this particular webinar. It's an opportunity for all of us and all of you, the biking and walking community, to weigh in on the things that you want to see happen at the state level, and to ask Curt questions about how he sees things and how you might get things done in your community or in the state, and questions about what's on the table and what's coming up for the state. I'm going to introduce Curt. I think probably a lot of you know him already. He's our new chair of the House Transportation Committee. It's the committee on the House side that is our friend and ally in trying to get good biking and walking infrastructure and policy in the state. And Curt is also a bike walk advocate of the kind that actually lives it. So he is car free. He gets around by walking and biking. He gets from Burlington, where he lives, to Montpelier, where he works at the State House, via the bus and his own transportation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Curt. I do want to say one thing, that after Curt does a little intro on some thoughts about how things work at the state level and some of his experiences, we will be taking this into the direction of a dialogue, and we will be opening it up to all of you to either ask your questions directly, or to, if you want to send them in to us on the sidebar, just in the question box, put them there, and we've got a team here that's looking at those, and we'll batch them up and we'll ask them back. So we'll be able to get that feedback live with everyone here. So this is Curt McCormack.
Thank you, Karen. Little on my background. I was in the legislature representing the city of Rutland, lived in Rutland for 30 years, and then moved to Montpelier and then Burlington after a stint in the Peace Corps. I was bicycle pedestrian coordinator in 1996 and 1997. As a matter of fact, I actually resigned my seat in the legislature to take that job. And I was chairing a committee at the time, Natural Resources and Energy. And then for 17 years, I was out of the legislature and was doing environmental consulting, including energy and including some railroad work. And then I moved to Burlington and ran for the legislature again, and I represent Burlington now. And I'm the chair of the Transportation Committee in the House. The legislative process, where do I begin? Just briefly, in this committee, we do mainly two big bills, and then we have about 40, 45 bills that have been introduced that were assigned to our committee, but every one of those bills, if we're interested in them, and we are interested in a few of them, will be incorporated into one of those two bills. We don't have to do that, but that's been the history, and I'm continuing to do that. So the biggest bill is called the T bill, the transportation bill, and that goes in the House first, and then we pass it and goes to the Senate. And we have done that. That bill is now in the Senate. The other one's called the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill, and that bill starts in the Senate, and it has passed the Senate and is in my committee now. So if you're looking at a bill and you're wondering what's happening to it, if it hasn't moved, it may not be dead. It may be in one of those other bills. We move one or two individual ones. The Senate more likely to, but again, most of them are in those two bills. How can biped advocates advocate effectively in the State House? That's a great question. I think that you guys already do a great job. I guess when there's an issue, something that you can get behind, and that makes sense. We just need more of that, get to know your legislators, especially the ones that represent you in the Senate and the House. And if you haven't been to the State House and lobbied, it's really a pretty friendly place. We're very busy, but you don't have to go through staff to get to a member. You'll find them, and it's probably one of the friendliest legislative bodies for the public to advocate and to talk to in the country, including most city halls, I think. What's currently on the table for biped? Well, what's currently on the table is what's happening, the biped program, the Agency of Transportation, about $13 million. But there's really nothing happening right now beyond what the Agency of Transportation is putting forward in their budget. That first bill I mentioned, the T bill. So that's why I am so happy and very more than willing and wanted to do this webinar, because I really am looking for ideas from you guys about what we should do.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Curt. So we were getting questions coming in, which was what we wanted. We wanted to turn this whole webinar over pretty quickly to the audience to have a dialogue about this. Before we do that, we have a question of our own that we want to ask. And so we'll be looking through some of the questions that are coming in while that's happening, but please continue to send those questions in. And also feel free when we turn this over to more of a dialogue with all of you to raise your hand if you want to ask your question directly, but either way works fine for us. So I'm going to have Allegra, who's sitting next to me, ask a question in a second that we've been thinking about here at Local Motion related to funding. But I just want to frame up a little bit how Local Motion has been thinking about the biking and walking situation in the state. We've worked pretty heavily in Burlington over the years. I think Burlington has made some great strides. There's good infrastructure being laid down now. Last summer was a stellar year. There's more coming. You know, we're learning that maintaining that infrastructure is just as important as putting it down. But we're trying to work out the kinks on that too, to make it work all year round. and getting the cities to think about maintenance in the places where we do work. And we work in a lot of other towns too, where they're just beginning to get on that path of developing out their own biking and walking culture. And I want to talk about culture for a second, because it's really important to us that if you want to shift the transportation system in the state to something that works for all users, including people that travel by bike and people that travel by foot, and by the, most people are able to travel by foot, and some people choose to travel by bike, and they should be able to use the transportation system in either case. And right now, in some places, it's nearly impossible. And I think you can all think about places that you try to get from and to where it's dangerous to do that on foot or on bike. So, but to shift that system requires a real shift in the culture and the narrative in a state. And it is starting to shift in Vermont to one that says that there is a right for people to be using this public realm in ways that benefit them, even when they're not in a car. And I think that Locomotion has been pushing, and will start to push even harder on that shifting of that narrative and that understanding that the public realm, whether it's the street or the sidewalk or the surrounding adjacent areas, is a place that should be safe for bikers and walkers to be. And for a long time in our country, that public realm has been the domain of the car. And a lot of our transportation policy, a lot of our transportation guidelines, et cetera, are really geared toward the car, and I think at a detriment, in a detriment to the people that are traveling by bike, or the people that are trying to travel by walking. So we're working hard on that. We want some more support, financial and otherwise, for bike walk infrastructure, and specific things that would really incentivize both the funding to support everyone having a space on that roadway or that sidewalk, as well as the policies and the incentives and the guides and all the things that make that possible. So our first question from us, and then we'll go to some of the ones from you all, is from Allegra's going to ask that, and we'll start our dialogue now.
So it's sort of a two-part question. The first part is around how we increase the amount of funding, not just for planning for bike and pedestrian infrastructure, but also for just getting projects on the ground. And then the second piece of that is, given sort of the limited amount of funding available, how can we be more creative at finding other ways to fund this work? So for instance, thinking about, if we're charging more for parking, if parking is free or low cost, how do we sort of incentivize the kinds of behaviors we want and discourage those that we don't, and sort of along the lines of looking at parking policy as a potential bucket of funding for bike ped improvements.
So you mean ceasing free parking where parking's actually not free? Yeah, well, that alone would be a very good step. Well, on federal funding, as you know, the T-bill bottom line is just over $600 million this year, and 13 of that will be for bike ped, but bicycle pedestrian. But we could get more out of that 600 and increase without increasing the 600. And we use the term flexing. We can flex, which means some funds are flexible. And so flexing, that's how we get a lot of the money we put into public transit right now, comes from highway that you are allowed to use. You get federal highway dollars. So we could flex more, and we should make sure we're flexing as much as we're allowed to, I think. And I don't know how close to that we are. They tell us, they, as the Agency of Transportation, or VTrans, they tell us that we can't flex anymore on transit, but I don't know. I have not asked that question on bike ped. And then there's a lot of good ideas for funding. My favorite is probably fee-bates. But with all these, before I quickly explain that, with all these things, there's two ways to go. One is to keep them revenue neutral, so you don't increase funding for something like bike ped out of it, but you make the taxing correct. So fee-bates would be like car registrations. Every year when you register your car, if you had a high mileage car, a car that gets good gas mileage, the better it gets, the more money you're going to actually get from the system, and you're not even going to pay anything.
Right.
It's kind of really like sort of a gas special tax. So you pick that line, let's say 30 miles per gallon, and every one below that, the mileage-wise, you pay, and then you pay a lot if you get really bad gas mileage. You can keep that revenue neutral just to do that and try to incentivize the purchasing of smaller cars versus big cars, or you could do that and then take some of the money, which means you have less to give for the incentive. But so you could do that, and there's other things like that, like UVM now at University of Vermont. Parking is no longer free for employees. They pay up to $600 a year, and it's actually fairly progressive. If it's based on your salary, so the more you make, the more you pay. Unfortunately, it's capped at $100,000 in income, but in salary. But and then they give free bus passes, which you can use anytime on all the buses, including the Link bus to Montpelier. But to further answer the question, not to divert from it, and you'd be happy to know that I doing this last, answering your question. When I was bike ped coordinator, there's an older gentleman who was probably my age, who worked there at the time. I think he was what today we would call the CFO. And I assumed that he was no longer living there. I just learned he's still not only living, he's still working there, which was great to hear. It's been more than 20 years since I was there. Anyway, I was in his office looking for money and looking for ways to get the money moving faster. Sometimes it's not the money itself; it's just actually cutting up the check for projects. I was hired to get projects out the door because they were getting bogged down. And he told me something I will never forget. And I've repeated it to the Secretary of Transportation and to others, and nobody disagrees with this. He looked across his desk and he said to me that he's been working there at that time, like 34 years or something. So now he's been there like 56 years. And he said all the projects go through him for funding. He has a hand in all that, not necessarily a decision, but a hand in moving the money to the projects, all projects that the agency constructs. And he told me he's never seen lack of funding be the reason a project got bogged down or did not move forward. So in terms of the projects that we look at that are, let's say, on the books, but just aren't getting built year after year after year after year, this fellow says money's not the reason. So.
Great. So I'm going to ask one of the questions that's come in because it's related to another one we had queued up, and that'll give Allegra time to look at what else is there. I need that to stay there for a second. So this is coming in from Bill. He says, we need more public announcements to help drivers understand the amount of space that by law they need to give to cyclists. Use easily understood language like an arm's length width of space. When people renew their driver's license, could people be required to answer a checklist of safety concerns before they get renewed licenses? That's his question. I'm going to add to that a little bit. One of the things that we've been wondering about, there's two pieces to this. One is there is a 4-foot guidance in the state. That's what you're supposed to provide. Yep. Some states mandate that. Some states put up signs all over the place that remind you of that. I think that would be helpful. The other part of this is we do some work with the driver's ed classes when we're invited in. We'll do some training around how to drive around a biker and a walker. So in addition to Bill's suggestion that it be part of your renewal, that you actually have to acknowledge that you understand that, why can't it just be embedded right in the driver's ed for all students that are learning to drive in schools and all new Americans that are getting a license for the first time? Not just the 4-foot rule, but just how to behave on the road around a biker and walker to make them safe. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, Bill. I was on the Transportation Committee when we passed that 4 or 5 years ago. And I think we did mandate it, didn't we? You said some states It's just guidance?
Yeah.
We don't mandate it.
No.
Oh,
So I
geez.
don't
All
think
right,
that you
well,
can, in my understanding is that would only come into play where you had a lawsuit. Your rights are not as strong as they would be.
But you cannot be ticketed for being too close to the
Right,
light.
true.
Okay,
And
well.
I don't think it happens very much.
Well, that's the first thing I'm going to look at.
Yeah.
It's to mandate that. Obviously, it should be mandated. And Bill's absolutely right. How many motorists are even aware of that, even after we mandate it?
Mhm.
We've mandated no engine idling. It would appear to me that almost no motorists seem to be aware of that, or thumb their nose at it.
Right.
The amount of engine idling going on these days. So we do need education. We need signs. I've been working on the engine idling and got the city of Burlington to put up a lot more signs, those orange signs. But same thing here. And neither one of these things, we're not looking to write a citation to anybody. We're looking to make people aware of it.
Mhm.
And that alone will save lives.
Yeah.
So good suggestions, Bill. As far as the license test, that might be more difficult politically, because right now it's very easy to renew your license. I renewed my driver's license when I was in the Peace Corps in Senegal. It was easily done without taking any exam. So some people think, seniors should be forced to take an eye exam. So it would go into that whole issue of should we have any kind of exam, and we probably should. So I think that's a good idea also, but a little more difficult than signs.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with you that people sometimes, I don't think everybody's setting out to do the wrong thing. I think a lot of people don't know. Just so to his point that what is 4 feet, I've seen people do campaigns where they put one of those float noodles off the back of their bike the kids play with in pools, to show that you got to be out there. So that's it's a simple guerrilla thing to do. But I think some signs on the road would help. And I think about campaigns like the state did their click it or ticket campaign, and they're still doing it. It's out there a lot on the blinking signs on the highways, reminding people that you have to do that. And I think that made a difference over time. People got it, like it's stuck in your brain. And so is there something like that could be done around the 4-foot rule? Is there something that could be done around what's called the Dutch reach, where when you open your car door, you actually reach with your right arm and you look behind you, so you don't open your car door into the biker coming up behind you? In Boston, I was just down there, and all of their meters have a little sign on it that describe the Dutch reach, just to remind you that is a thing. And if you see it enough, you might do it.
Yeah, well, that's a great idea. I living here in Burlington and getting around on my bike, the door zone is one of the scariest things.
Yeah.
I constantly daydream about one swinging open suddenly.
Right.
Especially when I've swung too far to the right, too close to them.
Well, and with narrow streets in New England and Vermont in particular, you often get the bike lane in that zone. There aren't a whole lot of other places to do it, or it's in the other zone on the other side.
So the bike lane is actually in the door zone.
Yeah, you can drive around Burlington. There's a few places where that is the case. So. Well, it's not technically, there's a little room there, but you know how that works. You got a car on one side and you got a door on the other. You got to decide which is going to.
And one's moving for sure.
One's moving for sure. So. Yeah. All right. So do we have another question?
We have a number of questions coming in, so we'll try to stick to the order that they've come in and unmute you so you guys can ask them directly. So we have
a couple of people responding directly to the phone.
Yeah, if they want to.
So we have a couple. Let's start with Liam Griffin.
Oh, he's not talking.
No, you're going to have to just
Oh,
ask.
okay, I wasn't sure.
If somebody wants to ask their question, raise your hand. Otherwise, we're going to read your questions for you. But we are looking for hands raised, and we'll try to call on folks too. We're going to try to get through as many of these as we can.
Okay, so Liam had a question around. So Liam had made a couple points. One was that the 4-foot passing rule is sort of in its current state is really sort of useless the way it's written. So you're just speaking to that and wanted to raise it.
Yep.
And then in 2016, when the state legislature passed updated safe passing recommendations, the left cross was officially made illegal, but language around right hooks was struck from the bill. Would love to hear any updates on the status of any right hook legislation.
Yeah, I was on the committee then, and as far as I know, I have not been on the committee since. So I've been on another committee in between for 2 years. But I don't believe there's been any action on that at all, and there certainly wasn't this year. Or this year's not over, but it would be tough this year. But again, I agree, and all I can do is apologize when things that aren't even so strong to begin with get further weakened in the process.
Thank you. So we also have a question from Tom Zanotti. So he was curious about if you could specify the exact bills in process currently, just to give more detail.
Well, those two big ones I mentioned, the numbers here, I'm forgetting, the T-bill I think is H529. It's right now in the Senate Transportation Committee. The other one that goes in the other direction, the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill, is S149, and that's actually we voted that bill out on Friday. So it's going to be up for action on the floor. Well, it went to Ways and Means because it affects some fees. So it's been committed to another committee, but they will probably be finished with it soon. So actually, I can't say exactly when that will be out, but if people want to take a look at it, if you go on our website, the legislative website, and both those bills, look for the latest version, and that one would be as passed by House Transportation Committee. And then you'll see the different things we did in there. And then the T-bill, you want to look at the latest thing that the Senate, they're making a number of changes to it. So you want to look for the Senate Committee on Transportation's latest version on that one. Then there's one other, S84, which is a bill that deals with the emission controls on cars and has nothing to do with bikes, other than the fact that bikers, more than even motorists, want clean air, and the bill's bad for clean air.
Yeah, and my understanding of that one, that it's not moving very quickly, because I'm part of a collaborative called Transportation for Vermonters, and we just heard that maybe we don't have to weigh in as heavily on that one as we thought.
Oh, I think you should weigh in, yeah. We are working on that bill, and actually we will be passing that bill out very much amended. But to give you an idea, this is one that the Senate really wants. Not only did they pass that, the Senate Committee on Transportation has taken that bill and put it as an amendment onto H529, the T-bill. So, no,
Right.
please
We'll watch
stay
for that.
Okay. And so we have a couple of folks who've raised their hands and would like to ask questions directly. So we're going to unmute Lou Brzee to be able to ask his question.
Lou, you can go ahead and talk. Make sure you're unmuted at your end too, from your phone or whatever you're on.
Well, I haven't figured out how this thing works yet.
We hear you.
In terms, when we speak of bike funding, how much gets discussed with regards to shoulder increasing?
We still have in the law a requirement that whenever they're paving major reconstruction, they must do the shoulder unless it's, quote, cost prohibitive. So that's a great question, and I think you and I would be in complete agreement about what should be done. It was more than 30 years ago that I introduced that bill that did pass way back in the 1980s. The problem can be that, what's cost prohibitive.
Yeah, we've had that question for a couple of years.
What's that?
I say we have had that question in debate for a couple of years.
Yeah, well, 30 years at least, I think. So one thing I have done is I've asked, when we do this T-bill, most of what that bill is recommended by the governor or the Agency of Transportation, and it's a big book and it's a budget, and it has all the projects in it and the different stages of projects. And they tell us about them and they go through each one, but they don't give us pictures. Now, you can find pictures on their website, but I've asked that when they come in and tell us about it into our committee, and we have these big screens now, and we're a paperless committee, so we're used to looking up there on that screen to see what we're talking about. I've asked them to provide in that big budget a picture of every single project, so that when we are looking at a bridge, a new bridge, or a paving job, we can ask, why don't I see more pavement there? And really get into scrutinizing each one of them. It's going to take a lot longer, but I really think that's what we need to do. And I do think that is the answer. My dream is that we will have a state that'll be known by out-of-staters that when you come to Vermont, you can ride safely anywhere, and that you have a right to be anywhere and everywhere. And by that, we mean you're safe in that place. We were talking earlier, so I live in Burlington, and the entrances to Burlington are, they're just shameful for a bicycle. Those who live in Chittenden County will know what I'm talking about. Virtually every entrance, Route 7 from the south, Route 2 from the east, Route 15 from the northeast, and even North Avenue from Colchester. You just can't ride it. You have to find other places to ride, or you have to, or people just don't ride it. And these are the entrances to the biggest city in the state. When I was in Rutland, Route 4 and Route 7, as they go through Rutland, not where it's a limited access, but where it's not limited access, is actually signed against bicycles. I don't know if that's still that. I haven't been down there in a while, but bicycles were prohibited to be on the road. And these are the roads that at least tourists are coming into. They don't know what other road to take. So we need paved shoulders everywhere, or a separated lane, or a bike track, a combination of bicycles everywhere. And that's what I need your help on. How do we make a plan that does that?
Okay, so we're getting so many questions in, which as the as the facilitators and organizers of this, you can't ask for better, but thank you, community. The phone lines are open. We're just working on it here. So we're trying to group things together. We are not probably going to get to all of these in the next half hour, so we will work with Curt to get some answers to some of these, and we'll do a blog post it or get it back out, but make sure that we get some of this is feedback for him, but I want to turn it back around to the community, so we'll find a way to do that. I'm just going to read a suggestion that someone had, and then we've got some questions that we've looped up around e-bikes. State transportation this is coming from Bethany. State transportation engineers don't really understand what it's like for cyclists on roads. I would suggest all engineers and other relevant designers or transportation officials spend time riding a bike on a road to understand the importance of width and better road markings and signs. So that's a suggestion for you to take back with you. And then we're going to
force engineers to ride bicycles.
Really, I think that's a great suggestion, and it will change their perception about this. I know that in some states they've had bus drivers set up on the side of the road of a highway on a stationary bike while traffic is going by in a controlled setting. But still, when you feel somebody go by you at 50 or 60 or 40 or 35, you can get a sense of what that is.
And also to go on trips to places where there is very good infrastructure.
Right.
So,
yeah,
experience it that way as well.
So we've got a few questions we're going to combine into an e-bike question for you. So Allegra's going to take that.
Yep, so kind of general question around how do we really incentivize e-bike use in Vermont? e-bike and local motion and many others are really pushing this from sort of a variety of angles, and both the accessibility piece, but for kind of rural commuting, longer distances, it's really seems to make a lot of sense. So what else could we be doing there? And
let me add to that too, that from our perspective at Local Motion, these are more people that are wanting the same infrastructure that all the non-e-bike bike. And what it's going to do is it's going to put more people on the road, because you can get places further. More people can get more places. They also can go a lot further. which means they're going to try to use those routes that you were describing, that are connectors outside of towns and in between towns. And so how does the state think about this, and how can they be helpful to make this part of the equation as well?
Well, we could incentivize it. Incentives for things that are kind of that personal, just like electric cars. You got to be careful that you're incentivizing people that actually need it. There's the not the easy rider, the free rider, which I always am with. Things like insulating my house. I didn't need incentives, but I got them. I'm not going to not go for them when I'm eligible, but it actually wasn't necessary for me to get me to do that. So, and I know in places like New York City, the e-bikes are awfully popular. And I don't know if they have an incentive or not, so I guess I am questioning.
So I can describe an incentive that's happening in the Burlington area. The Local Motion and V-Bike, which is down in the southern part of the state, have been working closely on there's a few different aspects to it, but one is that Burlington Electric has provided a rebate.
Yep.
And so if you want to buy an e-bike, you can get that rebate. You can also transfer that e-bike to a low-income purchase for someone else. Old Spokes Home, one of our partners in Burlington, is doing everything they can to make those bikes as affordable as they can. A lot of our shops around here sell all ranges of e-bikes. So the rebate itself is a good incentive to get people to do that. And we're looking at whether that can be done elsewhere. We have been providing, Locomotion's been providing e-bike lending library here. And Dave Cohen from V-Bikes helps us with this as well in the southern part of the state, where we can lend out a bike for free to anybody that wants to use it for a whole week. So you can try a cargo bike or a regular bike, a commuter bike, whatever, get your kids around, get your groceries around, get to work, and see if it works for you. And hopefully you will turn around and maybe buy a bike. And so far, about 25% of the people that have taken one of those free bikes for a week has done that. And I think that percentage is actually growing. And so there's an example. And we're about to take that to statewide. We're taking steps outside of Burlington and Chittenden County to bring those to libraries and work with bike shops in other states to make that something. So that's an incentive that we can do in a regional setting. And there may be examples of that we can find on the statewide. Great.
So we have a question coming in from Pierre, who wanted to speak directly. So we're going to unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm Pierre, and I've been a volunteer over at Old Spokes Home. Well, actually, Bike Recycle Vermont, when it was actually part of the Local Motion some years back. And I just wanted to mention that even though Old Spokes Home has moved, is no longer in its the prior location there on North Winooski, and it's moved across the street, and but our Bike Recycle Vermont function is still alive. In other words, people who are on some kind of social service or low-income people, that sort of person, they're still welcome in there. I realize that since we don't operate out of the basement anymore, since everybody comes in through the main store door there on where the Good News Garage used to be. I just want to mention that everybody is still welcome. The people who qualified in the past for discounted bikes, they're still welcome in there, and there are still plenty of bikes, even though there might be a price tag on them, which represents market value for them. If you are, if you qualify, you can still pick up a bike for with a large discount. And not only bikes, but safety accessories like helmets.
So they just go right into Old Spokes Home, you're saying?
That's right. Yeah, you should go in the main entrance there, which is where the Good News Garage used to be.
That's great. Yeah, I just saw their new space this past week, and it's pretty awesome. And it's a bit of a community center, so that people should feel free to do that. And like I mentioned earlier, they also are trying to get e-bikes in the hands of low-income folks as well, using those rebates and other methods, because for some people, it's not a choice that you're biking. a lot of us, it's a choice perhaps. But if it's your mode of transportation, an e-bike can help you get from the bottom of Burlington up to your job up on the hill in a way that is sustainable over time for you. Thank you for that. Do we have other questions coming in?
Lots more.
Okay.
So shifting gears a little bit, someone wondering how we can better involve municipalities in the planning process for highway projects so that the bike and pedestrian infrastructure is as good as it can be. So engaging municipalities and others earlier so that there can be more voices and more of that input when it's still possible.
I think that's a really good idea. The agency and the legislature, even more so, is loath to do something that if the community doesn't want, where a project is to be located. So I think that's a great idea. That if the town said, you know, when you pave this stretch of highway, we want a good shoulder, then remember what I said before. It really is something that stays with me because I really think it's true. And it was my experience when I worked at the agency that if paving a shoulder is going to cost more, they will find the money. That's really not the question.
There's a will, there's a way.
Yep. So it really help if the towns were demanding that as well.
Question from Marshall about kind of integrating transportation planning and land use planning. And just what can the House Transportation Committee do to discourage sprawl and incentivize compact development to better facilitate active modes of transportation?
Yep. I think the worst thing our culture has ever done is inventing and then building suburban sprawl and exurban sprawl. It's the main reason we're having this discussion today. It's just detrimental in so many ways. So what can we do about that? Much of that is not in my committee. There's an Act 250 bill moving through the House Committee on Natural Resources and Water Resources. That looks like a really good bill from what I've heard about it. It's very comprehensive, most comprehensive redoing of Act 250 probably since its inception in 1970. When I was on that committee a few years ago, we did change some language in Section 9L, for those who know Act 250, making sprawl pretty difficult to create or to expand in developments. But Act 250 only regulates about 40% of the construction that takes place in the state. So we need to do more than that. One thing transportation itself could help tremendously by improving transit and again, bicycle pedestrian infrastructure. Usually we're kind of on the other side of that. We are dealing with, why are those entrances to Burlington difficult, as I mentioned? They're difficult because they make no accommodation for bikes at all. But why is accommodation important? Because the streets and those roads are loaded with cars and big trucks. So I think we need to stop trying to build more parking in our cities, and we should stop trying to get people to drive into town. We should try to get them to take transit into town and to ride their bicycles into town if they're close enough to walk into town. And leave the personal passenger car to people who are handicapped or at least in a 4-person carpool. So I'm not sure I've answered the question, but let me say I couldn't agree more that needs to be done. I think someday we will be literally changing the Constitution. But until we do that, we are up against the property rights of someone that wants to do whatever they want with their property, which might mean create sprawl out of a beautiful meadow.
Great. So I'm going to shift a little here. We got a comment from someone which I think is spot on, that in fairness, the issue about bicyclists ignoring laws, there is an issue about bicyclists ignoring laws and common courtesy that's also part of the public education need. It's not just, it's everybody on the roads needs to understand and behave the way they need to make it safe for everyone. And so that's something that we talk a lot about here because we do a lot of workshops for the bicyclists. We've done some things and where we've talked about how can we let the motorists know how to behave. You heard the conversation earlier about the 4-foot or the Dutch reach or any of those kinds of things. Signage campaigns can help. We are doing something with Ski Rack, one of our partners in Burlington, to create a series of videos that talk about how a biker should behave at an intersection and how buses and bikes have to interact and all that kind of stuff. If anybody has any extra money kicking around out there, I'd love to do a video, and maybe the state can do this the same way they do for distracted drivers and others. Something that is in the head, in the mind, in the point of view of a driver as they are approaching or around a biker. What are they thinking about? How should they be thinking about that? And try to get people to see something that probably happens every time a driver comes across an intersection with a biker. They're not sure what to do. I think if we kind of help them understand that, it would go a lot better. If we help the police understand how that's supposed to work, that would help. So how do we get that to happen?
I think the fact is that the police don't enforce against bicycle riders. They've never enforced against me, and there were certainly many times they could have.
Yeah.
But I would add that I find that when you are on your bike and you obey the rules of the road and the lights and everything, and you can even act like a car, get into a busy left-hand turning lane, get right in the middle of it, and do it right. Don't jump the gun when your light comes and you go. I find that every motorist, in my experience, completely respects that, and you do not get any shouts out the window, get off the road, or anything like that. You get complete respect, and they back off away. They know you're going to take a little longer to get to speed and get around the corner, whatever you're doing. But when you do it the right way, you're completely respected, and that makes it safer, because those guys screaming at you are probably not obeying the 4-foot rule while they're doing that.
That's true. And I think there are going to always be players on the road that will never behave well, but I think my sense is that most people are trying, and if they just understood, so the more we can all do to educate, the better. This came in from V-Trans, from someone at V-Trans who worked in your role before. V-Trans V-Trans used to host a bike facility design training a few years ago that V-Trans engineers, for those of you who don't know, V-Trans is the state transportation agency. Engineers participated in, and it included an on-bike component. So when we were talking earlier about trying it out, it sounds like that used to happen. Let's do that again. So I think all of us that have the ability to push on that should push on that a little bit. I think that does make a difference. It gives you a perspective that you wouldn't have otherwise. So thank you for that. What else do we have here?
So we have a couple other folks who want to ask their questions directly. So we have David. We'll unmute you.
He's not muted.
So
He should unmute himself.
David, you're going to have.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, do I need to state my question?
Sure, yep.
Okay, well, there's two parts to it. First, I'm wondering, I heard mention made of, putting a tax on cars based on miles per gallon, which, at least in the short run, I favor. However, as I understand it, there's legislation moving through, and there's going to have to ultimately be a tax so that EVs pay for road use. Yep. And by the way, I'm an EV user, but I still support the idea that eventually people should be paying based on wear and tear as well as air pollution. So, that's something that needs to be considered. How about stiffer penalties? This is a separate question. How about stiffer penalties for drivers that do not show deference to vulnerable users? And right now, I think people, and your description, Curt, of what goes on in a more, urban setting. I used to live in Chittenden County, and yes, if I feel bold enough, and I do, to take a lane and obey traffic signals, which I do, I agree. I usually get respect from motorists. However, most of the state doesn't have stop and go traffic with stoplights. And that's where I would like to see bicycles get the same deference that people driving tractors get. And if we're seen as vulnerable users, like somebody on a horse or somebody driving a tractor with hay in the back, we'll get a lot more people willing to bike because they'll see it as safer. In New Jersey, the police wanted more deference towards pedestrians. So they put cops undercover as pedestrians, and they started nabbing people. And the penalties for violating crosswalks became stiff, and motorists changed their behavior. And I would like to see stiffer penalties and some way for the police to go undercover and nab people for violating the rights of pedestrians and cyclists.
Great. Thank you, David.
I agree, and I tried to do triple penalties for speeding in a work zone, and I couldn't get that. Part of our problem, David, and again, I really agree with you, and I hadn't thought of this one, and I'll try it. But part of our problem is actually the police. When the police find, when it's their opinion that a penalty is too high, then they tend to enforce that thing less, that crime. And that's just a shame. And it's an interesting issue about when does the executive branch of government have to enforce a law and when do they not? But as a legislator, it can be very frustrating because they're acting as legislators when they do that. When they choose to enforce and not to enforce, what they're doing is they're saying no to some law and yes to others. And it hinges on the amount of the penalty. So I would guess that you would agree with me that when people speed in their cars in a work zone, because they don't see anybody at the moment they enter the work zone, and they think it's okay to keep going at a high speed, is outrageous and needs to be stopped. And the flaggers, there's actually an association of highway flaggers, and they wanted that, and I totally agree with them as I do with you. So we'll try that. I think it's going to take, all of us together, and I really mean that. It doesn't just sound nice. We need, I needed more than those flaggers. I needed some more people to come forward and say, this makes sense. This crime is not acceptable. It needs to be taken more seriously by motorists. Same thing with how they deal with, how they interface with vulnerable users like bicyclists.
Great. So I'm gonna, we've only got a few minutes left here, so I'm gonna try to tick off a few of just comments that I think are worth just putting out. We've got a lot of things we're not gonna get to again. We will find a way to do this. Plus this whole thing is being recorded, so if folks wanna listen to this again or share it, that will be possible. We'll be getting back in touch with people with both some of the answers to this. We'll probably do some sort of blog post where we can post it on with our various partners through their sites to get it back out and send it directly. So one comment, I constantly see people on their phones. To me, they are the biggest danger to cyclists face on the road. I think they're the biggest danger that all of us face for people on the road, and I'm amazed that we see so much of that. So that's a comment. Questions about when will it be possible to post your the roads at 20 miles or lower speeds under certain circumstances. I mean, that would be great. Or, maybe more traffic coming, and let's just make a big snarl of the road so it's safe to get through. On the snarl on the road situation, sometimes when V-Trans does new paving projects, they don't put in enough width on the side of the road for bikers. And why not?
During construction?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, you've got to ride in the holes with the cars.
Yeah, and there's the riding in the holes with the cars part. So a biker should be, it's like, wow, is this road not for us also? There's that part of it, and then there's the other question in here somewhere about, that minimum width that people should have on the road. I know I saw V-Trans out correcting something in, must be Essex, Jericho, Richmond area, where the lines were put in incorrectly. It was not their fault, but they're correcting it quickly because they created sort of a death trap there for bikers, and that's not safe for anyone. We do have somebody on the line that we want to, Peter,
Peter?
Peter, if you want to, we're going to open up the line for you if you want to ask your question directly.
Sure. Hi, Curt. It's Peter Johnke from the Vermont Center for Independent Living. And I just would like to see some policies. I'm really encouraged by the things going on with e-bikes and some of the incentives, but I think people are still just unaware that we need e-bikes that are accessible for people with disabilities. So some way to ensure that, you know, if you have a group of them that are available to the public, then you should also have at least one that is somehow, I mean, it's a little tricky, but there are some that are somewhat universally accessible.
Even like a 3 or 4 wheeler?
That's one way to do it. Sometimes you have to configure seats a little differently if somebody doesn't have a lot of upper body strength, so that they can, you know, don't have to worry about balance as much. I mean, there's a variety of things to do, and it would take a little research and a little creativity. But I just think a lot of times it's an awareness thing. It's like the old thing when we first came out with the Americans with Disabilities Act almost 30 years ago. You know, you would go to a store to assess them, and they would say, well, nobody with disabilities ever comes in here. Well, they don't come in there because they can't get in. And so I think it's the same sort of thing with bikes. Nobody comes to your, you know, bike rental place or your e-bike place because they can't use them. So we just have to do some education and try to ensure that we get some accessible bikes.
Yeah, I agree. Sounds good, Peter.
Yeah, it's a great
Yeah.
suggestion, and I'm going to think on that one as well. I think you're right, some research needed, but I bet you will find that that's been solved somewhere in the world, and we should be looking at that. There's an observation here, and this is something that I've thought about myself, is that Vermont, like the rest of the country, has many more pedestrians and cyclists involved in crashes with vehicles, yet most of the comments we've been talking about have to do with bicycling. That's also true of just the, you know, where the focus on infrastructure and the money goes often. Need to be equal focus on pedestrian needs. Most of the municipal initiative grant programs that we fund are for sidewalks. So you know, the state does put a lot of money into pedestrian safety too, and sometimes in these conversations we find ourselves talking a lot about bikes, and I think the reason for that is that there are people who walk and there are people who bike. The people who walk are everyone, and so you don't think of yourself as being a pedestrian, and therefore you have a voice that you should be putting out there, and Locomotion's trying to work with partners, AARP and others, where that voice is really strong and should be heard. But yes, that for that question giver, that is a thing that we all share, and I think it's important to remember that. I'm going to riff off of that for a second and say that when I look at the percentages of crashes nationally or in the state that are due to pedestrian and cyclist related, it's like 13 to 15 to 16% of all crashes are pedestrian and biking. And yet the money that is allocated from the feds for that, which trickles through the state, which goes to these projects, is in the 1% range. And so there's a real discrepancy between the money that's for this biking and walking infrastructure and the people who are paying the price on the roads. And I think that's an important thing to think about.
Yeah, I hadn't heard those.
I'm not sure I have the exact right, but it depends on where the funding's coming from, but it is out of line.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back to my earlier comment about what the public realm is for. You know, it's about moving cars quickly and easing up on congestion and getting people to work as fast as they can in their car. It's not about making it safe for the biker or the walker to get to work safely as fast as they can and as pleasantly.
It really isn't, and maintenance is the same way. I mean, this past winter, it occurs to me, as it does every winter and every spring, the condition of the sidewalks, including brand new sidewalks.
Yeah.
And in my neighborhood, the city has built some nice new sidewalks, which are great, but they're not maintained like the street is. And I've always thought it is wrong if you look out your window and the street is clear of snow and ice and the sidewalk hasn't been touched yet. There's something wrong with that.
Yeah.
And when we not only do it for bicycle and pedestrians, and you're so right about that, they don't tend to organize as a group like bikers do. Mm-hmm. We always add them, but do we enough?
Yeah, right, exactly. Good question. That was the question.
Yeah. But we also, and this is actually more important, we want to encourage new walkers and riders. How many people have you talked to that said, I used to love to ride my bike, but now that I'm older, I'm just afraid of the cars, and especially trucks, and they stopped riding.
Yeah.
Or maybe they never stopped.
Great. All right. Well, yeah. And on that point, and we're at time, that's part of what Locomotion does with our partners like Old Spokes and the bike shops and the various folks out there that are part of our network. And a lot of you, probably all of you, we're trying to get that to be the way of life, but a safe one. And that is the challenge here. So we're at time. Thank you all for your questions. Like I said, we had so many, we didn't get to them all, and all of them are good. We'll be batching these up and talking to Curt about them and see if we can get his feedback on some and make sure we get the comments that were delivered to him as well. So I would call that a success, that we had more than we could get to, but it's a drag. I'm going to hand this off to one last comment from Curt, and then we'll be done.
Karen, I want to thank you guys so much for this and all the people that participated. I'm really encouraged. Please stay in touch. I feel like today I'm going to start anew of improving making my dream come true about what Vermont could be like. And please stay in touch and do it through these guys. And I'm very accessible also.
Great. We'll try to do more of these, and we'll try to come up with some way to collect these kinds of things and have a conversation with you that's ongoing in both directions. So we're getting this back to folks. Yep. I can tell people are asking questions about how do I know what's going on? So we can certainly help with that. So thank you all. We will be posting this and sending it back to you so that you can share it and listen to it again if you missed parts of it, or for people that weren't here. So thank you very much. And thanks to my team for helping me make this happen, and for Curt for coming. And he's a busy guy, but he showed up and gave us some good feedback and conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Curt. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everybody.